Baik, selamat sore Bapak Ibu sekalian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Semoga kita semua dalam keadaan sehat walafiat bergabung pada webinar pada sore hari ini. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Prita Suyudi, and I will be your facilitator. I'll be moderating this webinar session this afternoon. And before we begin, I would like to read out some housekeeping rules. If I may have the slides, please. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, these are some housekeeping reminder for us, for all participants to note. There will be some technical matters and some information regarding the interpretation system. So this webinar is equipped with interpretation feature. And if you wish, please speak in English language and interpreters will interpret to Indonesian language and vice versa. Jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian, webinar ini dilengkapi dengan fitur interpretation. Bila berkenan, silahkan berdiskusi dalam bahasa Indonesia dan juru bahasa akan menerjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Inggris serta sebaliknya. And for English speaking participants, if you wish to listen to the English interpretation, you can click interpretation logo, which is down below on the bottom bar of your screen. Click interpretation, choose English, and you do not need to change channel when speaking. The participants and interpreter are still able to hear your voice. Baik, yang ini untuk Indonesia, untuk peserta pengguna bahasa Indonesia. Jika Anda ingin mendengar terjemahan dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan klik tombol interpretation, kemudian pilih Indonesian. Tidak perlu pindah channel saat bicara, Bapak Ibu, karena para peserta pertemuan lainnya dan juru bahasa tetap bisa mendengar Anda. Now, please ensure that your display, the display name represents your name as well as your institution. We have provided an example there on the screen, for example, Irshad from IISD. For the panelists, please make sure that you are on mute, except when requested to be unmute by the moderator or by MC. Now, if you would like to ask questions or give comments during or after presentation and during the Q&A session, please type them in the Q&A box by using the following format. We have there on the screen, you should type your name, the institution, and the question to whom you are addressing to, and the question itself. Since we are meeting online in this pandemic era, if you experience any technical problem, please notify the following co-host. The name of the co-host in this Zoom meeting room is technical support. And in the chat box, you can choose their name and send a private message to the co-host. Very well. We'll begin. The Project of International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, for webinar series program this afternoon. And this webinar series program is the second webinar held by IISD as their part of their project. And this afternoon, we're going to take on the theme of international energy, environmental, and society dialogue. And this initiative aims to create a platform to share best international practices on energy policy and green recovery with the Indonesian government officials. As this is the webinar series program, this is the second webinar series program. The first one was already done last month, I believe. And the overall theme or the overall topic is the feasibility of green taxation policy in Indonesia. Can the Nordic model of green taxation provide a path to post-pandemic recovery? As we have mentioned before, the program kicks off with its first webinar under the title Green Recovery in Indonesia, the Role of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. And this webinar this afternoon will discuss further on the tax measures in Indonesia to recover its economy from the COVID-19 pandemic, where we will cover later on, the success stories and strategies of the implementation of green taxation policy in Nordic countries, the key challenges and opportunities in Indonesia to implement green taxation and green taxation strategies for Indonesia. And we're very pleased to inform that we have a number of renowned and excellent speakers. We have Mr. Paul Weston, Mr. Noor Shaifuddin, Mr. Bagus Agung Rahadiansyah, Pak Andi, and Mr. Firman Tatarianto, Mr. Paul Burke. And there will be also an opening remarks from Ms. Tara Lan. But before all of that, before we go into our discussion this afternoon, let's take a photo session. We may be online, but it does not prevent us from taking group picture. Our technical team will help me with taking the pictures. Ladies and gentlemen, if you will, please open your camera. Where the screen should show.
Right. Let me help with the countdown.
Thank you, John.
I will count 1, 2. I will wait for Mr. Sanchez and Ms. Sanchez. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's do it again. One more time. 1, 2, 3. And another one. 1, 2, 3. Back to you, Prita.
Thank you so much for that. And now for the opening remark of today's webinar, Ms. Tara Lan, the Senior Associate, International Institute for Sustainable Development. Ms. Lan will speak about the Nordic model of green fiscal reform. Ms. Lan, the screen is yours.
I'll just get this slideshow started. There, is that working for everybody?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. So the purpose of my opening remarks is just to provide a brief introduction to the Nordic model of green fiscal reform for those who are less familiar with this topic. So what do we mean by green fiscal reform? Well, environmental taxes include the taxes that you would commonly recognise, like carbon taxes and maybe air pollution taxes. But they also include other taxes like energy taxes, transport taxes such as vehicle registration fees that might be based on emissions, and waste taxes. So they can be broader than what it might be commonly understood. Now, environmental tax reform refers to the shifting of taxation from economic functions like labour, capital and consumption to activities that have a negative impact on the environment. And then environmental fiscal reform is a broader concept, again, that includes the reform of environmentally harmful subsidies and the spending of government revenues on socially or environmentally productive purposes, the spending of green taxation revenues or subsidy reform revenues. So why do we call it the Nordic model of green fiscal reform? Well, obviously many environmental taxes have been around for decades, particularly energy taxes have been around for a long time, even earlier than the beginning of the 20th century. But really what the Nordics did was pioneer a new approach of shifting from productive areas of the economy, taxation from productive areas of the economy to polluting areas. And this is characterised particularly by the imposition of carbon taxes in response to a regional financial crisis in the early 1990s by Denmark, Finland, Sweden and Norway. Iceland also imposed a carbon tax in response to the 2008 global financial crisis, and that carbon tax was in place in 2010. And the Nordics are also well known for taxing energy, transport, air pollutants and waste. So they really have pioneered this area of environmental taxation. So how does it work? Well, at the heart of the idea of green fiscal reform is taxing pollution and the polluter pays principle. And this has two key effects. The first is to create price signals that are a signal for consumers and producers to reduce pollution. and also for investors to shift to green technologies. Another effect, of course, of any taxation is the revenue produced, and how these revenues are spent has a major impact on the effect of green fiscal reform. So one of the things that is commonly done is to use those pollution tax revenues to cut labour and business taxes. Now, labour and business taxes are a real drag on the economy because they create a disincentive to work and a disincentive to employ. So by reducing those taxes, you can increase jobs and boost productivity. And this is something that was done by Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. They all reduced income taxes when they imposed a carbon tax in the early 90s, and they also reduced social security contributions by businesses, which reduced the burden on business and labour. Revenues can also be used to fund green industries. This is commonly done through either earmarking, it can be explicit or implicit. So governments can allocate a certain proportion of revenue to fund green industries or green research and development, or they can just put all the money to consolidated revenue and then fund these subsidies or research. Now, this creates exports, jobs, and regional development because, for example, funding renewable energy will create jobs in distributed energy in regional areas and can also create an export industry. And a great example of this is the Danish wind industry, which now employs over 35,000 people, direct employees, and I think accounts for around 7% of all Danish exports. And that was fostered through decades of various fiscal reforms, including subsidies and targeted taxation. So, of course, revenues can also be used to boost general revenue, and these can be used for important things in the context of a pandemic recovery, like social spending, stimulus, and debt reduction. And Iceland, for example, dedicated all of its carbon tax revenues post the global financial crisis to reducing its fiscal deficit. How much
excuse me.
Yeah.
Ms. Tara, could you please speak a bit slower for the interpretation, please? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Betty. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. So how much revenue are we talking about? Environmental taxes raised between 7 billion and 13 billion in all Nordic countries in 2018, except Iceland, which raised less than 1 billion, but that's a very small country. And all Nordics have at least 2 times the environmental tax per capita as the OECD average and 7.5 times the global median. So environmental tax revenues will decline as consumers adapt behaviour. So you can see from this graph here that from around 2008, 2009, we start to see a reduction in revenues. This is because consumers and producers start to adapt their behaviour to reduce pollution, which is exactly what you want to happen, but it does cause a decline in revenue. This can be countered by increasing the taxation rate or by reducing exemptions, for example, to a carbon tax to maintain not only constant revenues, but also to maintain incentives to reduce pollution. And while eventually an environmental tax should go to zero in revenue as the pollution goes to zero, it does take quite a lot of time, and there is an opportunity for policymakers to adapt and diversify the tax base. So what are the effects on economic growth and jobs? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I think Paul is going to talk about this in the context of Sweden. But just to give a quick overview, all Nordics experienced strong GDP growth after their green fiscal reforms. Iceland, for example, the GDP per capita grew 77% between 2009 and 2018 after a carbon tax was introduced. Norway had strong economic growth and low unemployment through 2000s, even while it was increasing its carbon tax and phasing out exemptions. Most studies find net positive impacts on employment with green fiscal reforms when they're accompanied by reductions to distortionary taxes. And there's an excellent statistic here based on modelling of Denmark's green tax shift. What we see is that Denmark was projected to have, for every 1% GDP increase in energy taxes, was projected to cause a 2% drop in employment. So yes, higher energy taxes will have a negative impact on the economy and on employment. But for every same 1% decrease in employment taxes, so the same value, there was a 4% increase in unemployment. Sorry, a projection. This is all modelling, so not empirical evidence. But what this shows is that there's a net 2% gain in employment with the green tax shift. So another recent study on Europe, including many of the Nordics, showed that there is a 0 to slightly positive effect on GDP growth and employment from carbon taxes, and no evidence of adverse effects. What we also see in the Nordics is a decoupling of GDP growth and carbon pollution. So the graph on the left here shows all the Nordics total GDP in US dollars, billions, and greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that greenhouse gas emissions have dropped while GDP has increased. Now, I've shown this same graph again on the right, minus Norway. And Norway is a major oil and gas producer, so it tends to skew the results a bit. But you can see here, minus Norway, the trend is even stronger of decoupling. So what are the implications for Indonesia? Again, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because other speakers will speak on it. But I think it's important to note that green fiscal reform has major potential to assist Indonesia with post-pandemic economic recovery if taxation is done in a progressive way and if revenues are spent productively. Of course, every economist in the world can agree on what might work economically, but this is not going to happen if the political side is not there. So the political economy challenges in Indonesia are significant, but the Nordic model does have some answers here. It shows that you can win political support through revenue neutrality, which is recycling all the revenues back into the economy, particularly for popular purposes and for in ways that assist jobs and assist the poor. Also gradually phasing in higher taxes and reducing exemptions can help, and funding alternatives such as low pollution technology can make a big difference to political acceptance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Lan. For the opening remarks, ladies and gentlemen, that was Ms. Tara Lan. She is a senior associate at International Institute for Sustainable Development. I am told to speak slower. Previously, she was a team leader at Department of Premier and Cabinet State Government of Victoria, Australia, and senior advisor for trade policy at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Australian government from 2003 and 2005. So now, Ms. Tara Lan previously spoke about how the green fiscal works overall. And it is indeed that green tax could bring revenue and drives economic activities, and all at once could also reduce the emission. We are now off to speaker number 2, which is a keynote speech for this webinar, which will be delivered by Mr. Paul Weston. Mr. Paul Weston is the Senior Business Developer, International Markets Swedish Energy Agency, and he will talk about Swedish green taxation and recovery packages. But before that, allow me to just read out a short profile. Paul Weston is a senior business developer, international markets at Swedish Energy Agency. And previously, he was a counselor for energy affairs at Swedish Embassy in Jakarta and was the head of unit at Swedish Energy Agency for 14 years until 2016. Mr. Westin, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Krita, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Tara and IISD for having me, and an excellent introduction by Tara. Always happy to work together with the IISD. So I will try to focus a little bit more on the Swedish example on green taxation, especially the carbon tax, but also a little bit what the government has introduced in post-pandemic budget. So let me see if I can change the slides. Yes, so just a brief word about the Swedish Energy Agency, which I still represent. And we are very much part of the solution and benefiting from the revenues, I would say, as we transfer around of 200 to 300 million euros per year in R&D grants towards renewables and energy efficiency primarily. And why, what do we want to achieve in Sweden? So we have quite ambitious targets for energy and climate, 100% renewable electricity by 2040, better efficient use of energy by 50% in 2030, no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2045, and the transport sector, which is a big challenge at the moment, to reduce the emissions by 20% by 2030. And these are, of course, in line with the Paris Agreement and the Global Agenda 2030. And how to reach these goals? Well, that's where we in Sweden have used environmental taxes, which are a cost-effective way to try to reach targets. And I build this presentation very much on the source Carbon Taxation in Sweden by Daniel Waluszewski from the Ministry of Finance. He used to be also a colleague of mine previously, but I just want to credit him for this. So taxes are easier to administer, and of course we can also have other different support schemes also where we have to look into state aid rules, for example, within the European Union. And as Tara mentioned, we already mentioned, we started to introduce the carbon tax in the 1990s, and now we have quite high levels of carbon tax. I will come back to that. And that, of course, is achieving the climate target, and the energy tax is more of a fiscal tax, but it also steers towards better energy efficiency. And as Tara mentioned, how to introduce it, it was really gained political and public support as we reduced labor taxes, income taxes, with much more than the introduction of the carbon tax, as you can see here. So that was a way to get it started to do this green shift and to get the acceptance by politicians and the public. And currently the government, which is the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, but they have a coalition support when it comes to budget issues with the Center Party and the Liberals. So some of the things that they have all four have agreed on since the last election is to increase some of the environmental taxes and reduce tax reductions in certain areas. We have also introduced, which might be interesting for Indonesia also, a single-use plastic bags tax of approximately 5,000 Indonesian rupiah per bag. But I think this is, even though it might be a symbolic tax, it actually changes behavior. And then there are some other deals also between the parties. I will not go into that very much. Aside of the carbon tax, of course, Sweden as a member of the European Union is also taking part in the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And this includes all industry and also energy companies. So approximately 95% of Swedish fossil carbon emissions are covered by carbon tax or the European Union's emissions trading scheme. And here I put up also the figure, how much is the price for carbon in the scheme. It has fluctuated due to the pandemic, but it's usually around 30 euros per tons. And this can be compared to the sectors that are outside the emissions trading scheme in Sweden that are subject to the carbon tax. They actually face a price level of around 110 euros per ton, so significantly higher. And as you can see here, we started off by not introducing the same level for industry in order to keep the industry's international competitiveness. But recently it has been lined up with also the household sector and commercial sector. So the industry here represents the industry that is outside the emissions trading scheme. And as Tara mentioned, this is an indexed decoupling graph rather than in absolute terms. But as Tara mentioned, we have actually been able to have a significant growth of GDP as well as reduced carbon emissions at the same time. So this decoupling is quite interesting. Even though I would also like to mention that, of course, the GDP growth also has led to higher consumption of imported goods. So if you look at the consumption of imported carbon, the picture might change a bit. Another result is also that we now have a total share of renewables of more than 50%, higher than the actual target for last year. In the heating and cooling and electricity sectors, it's 2/3 of the use is actually renewables. And we have also overachieved very much on the transportation renewables target compared to the European Union target. And of course, you have to look into what are the effects on households and industry. But what has been a very significant change for the household has been the replacement of fossil fuels for heating, which fuel oil was very dominant in the heating sector up until the 1990s, and now it has already almost been totally phased out. Our main challenge is still in the vehicles and motor fuels sector. And as Tara mentioned, if we achieve the phase out of fossil fuels here, of course, then the revenues will drop significantly, and then we will have to look at other types of taxes. We might tax biofuels heavier in the future, or electricity for vehicles, for example, in order to also get the revenue to the state. And of course, the Nordic countries, including Sweden, are also welfare states. So this is something that is in addition and more developed here in the Nordics. So we also have general welfare and social transfer systems. So I think carbon taxation is a good idea because the polluter pays principle. It is also less administratively complex than, for example, a trading system. And it also raises the revenues, which can be used for other options. And the acceptance by the public and the political system is obviously very important. So discussing also the options that are made available in a broad sense is quite crucial. And also to do it in a step-by-step approach when introducing green taxation is a part of the success, I would say. So this is from my dear friend Daniel, and he highlights that political courage is needed and also to use the step-by-step approach, but also to have this broad dialogue between government, stakeholders, academia, as we are doing today. I just wanted to end with what I have some examples from the green recovery in the government budget for 2021, and some of the larger programs include the industry step program, where which is also handled by the Energy Agency. So we developed together with the industry demonstration and pilot programs in hydrogen and zero emission steel, for example, negative emissions from bio-based carbon capture and storage. There is also the opportunity to work with plastic refineries, biofuels, and battery production. And you can see some other measures that have been included in the budget. This is also, I know that the IISD has looked into different countries' post-pandemic recovery programs, and I think we have ended up with approximately the same figure. So approximately 2 billion euros or $2 billion of green recovery funding, and then plus credit guarantees at the same level. And this can be compared with the carbon tax revenue, which is at the same level, and the energy tax revenue, which is at 5 billion circa per year, and the total environmental taxes is about 10 billion euros per year, which is only, and that includes other taxes of pollutants, but also vehicle tax, as Tara mentioned. And this is still only about 2% of GDP. So I think this shows that it could be an example of using a step-by-step approach, even in Indonesia. I think it would be very interesting to hear how the following speakers will think and react to this. So thank you very much for your attention today.
Well, thank you, Papo, for giving us the overview on Swedish environmental tax implementation to reach your climate, environment, and energy policy goals that have been set by the government. And carbon tax is one of the approaches that could be implemented that is indeed, as you said, have its strengths and challenges, and that carbon tax is a good idea and is not rocket science. It means that it needs politic courage, politic package, cooperation between government, business, and academia. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I see some hands raised. I would like to remind participants, if you would like to ask questions to the panelists, you can do so by typing your questions in the Q&A box by stating your name, your organization, the question to whom it is going to be addressed to, and then the question itself. That's the most important thing. Now for the webinar, we're going to enter into the sessions. This webinar will be divided into 2 sessions, ladies and gentlemen. The first session is on green taxation policy in Indonesia, the challenges and opportunities. And in this session, tackling climate change in Indonesia through the role of carbon tax will be discussed. What is the industrial perspective on carbon tax implementation, and also what the policy mix looks like in Indonesia, the policy mix between environmental tax and tax policy implementation. For the first speaker in the first session, we have Mr. Noor Shaifuddin, PhD. Mr. Shaifuddin is Senior Policy Analyst, Center for Climate Finance and Multilateral Policy, Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia. And he has been awarded his Doctor of Philosophy from the Economics Department of Business School, University of Western Australia in 2018. And he is currently a Senior Policy Analyst at Center for Climate Finance and Multilateral Policy, Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance, Republic of Indonesia. Bapak Noor Shaifuddin, kami persilahkan, Pak.
Thank you, Mbak Prita. Yeah, yes, thanks,
Sama-sama,
Mbak Prita. Yes, for the opportunity, and very good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to show my presentation first, and it's very good opportunity to discuss and learn about the potential application of carbon tax, or maybe we may name it as the carbon levy in Indonesia. Yeah, and today I want to share our perspective and how the carbon levies actually lies among different kind of climate related policies in Indonesia, mostly from the fiscal perspective. So you can see my presentation, right? So yes, Indonesia is the issue of climate change in Indonesia is very vital, because we have these 2 issues. Actually, the first is from the adaptation issues. Indonesia is very vulnerable to the impact of the climate change, and at the same time, we also have issues in the emission that emitted from our economic activities, and you know, based on the study, that 80% of disaster occurrence in Indonesia mostly comes from the result of the meteorological disasters, which just comes from the issue of climate change. So then our leaders, they have a concern, very strong concern about the issue of climate change, and may also take part of the actions and put the commitment towards the UNFCCC COP in 2016 to and ratify the Paris Agreement in our law. So by 2030, Indonesia is determined to reduce its GHG emission by 29% unconditionally, and 41% with the support from the international. And from the commitment, we have 5 different sectors which are expected to support the emission reduction until 2030. From the adaptation sectors itself, we have also 5 different agenda, mostly to tackle the impact of the climate change. And from our commitment, so then we formulate a couple policies. The first is by enacting the National Acting Plan on GHG emission reduction, or we name it as the RUN KRK by 2011. And then we have in 2014 as the National Action Plan on Climate Adaptation, or RUN-API. And again, our NDC back to in 2016. And also we put the issue on the climate change in our national midterm development plan by introducing what the so-called as the low carbon development initiative. And also we have a national action plan on sustainable development goals by 2017. So from the commitment, so the Ministry of Finance, we may look at the issue of climate change in Indonesia from the climate finance perspective, where according to the second biennial update report, Indonesia is estimated to need about 247.2 billion US dollar, or it's about 266.2 trillion rupiah annually to achieve the NDC. So it's a quite huge amount of money for us, and based on that, so we try to map the potential climate finance that we can utilize. So we distinct it from three main sources. That is from the domestic public sources, it's from our budget side, and then international public sources, and also from the private sources. Okay, because I just have about 10 to 15 minutes, so then I will go through from this side. Yeah, and since 2014, the Ministry of Finance conducting the climate budget taking system to tag or to recognize the public allocation, the public fund allocation to tackle the issue of climate change. And according to our tagging system, then we found that annually the state budget may only cover about 34% of the total financing needs in every year. This is of course needs very strong commitment from different stakeholders to also tackle this issue. So from the fiscal AMLANG, we have three different AMLANG. The first is from our government budget spending, and the second is from the revenue side, and the last one is from the financing. According to our budget system, climate budget tagging system, so we know that we need further support from different actors in economy to also support the financing needs of tackling the issue of climate change. And from the
Pak Nur, mohon maaf,
Yes.
untuk presentasinya bisa full di fullkan?
Ini caranya gimana ya?
Yang
Biar-
ini ya, yang gambar komputer. Pak John, bisa dibantu Pak John?
Atau saya ini aja ya, saya stop biar nanti Pak Jan aja ya. Oke.
Ya, Bang John bisa di-share punya Pak Nur?
Bisa, sebentar ya, Mbak. Kita
Ya.
buka dari sini.
Betul, terima
Oke.
kasih. Maaf Pak Nur ya, karena terlalu kecil.
Ya.
Ini kan tolong
Oke.
dibuka untuk presentasi Pak Firman.
Pak Nur, bukan Pak
Bukan
Firman.
Pak Firman, John. Pak Nur
Maaf,
Syaifuddin.
Pak Nur.
Maybe I.
Sebentar ya Pak Nur.
Yeah.
Maaf Pak Nur, presentasi Pak Nur belum kami terima. Apa bisa kita coba share ulang Pak dari Bapak?
Oke.
Saya akan pandu.
Oke.
Baik Pak Nur, di bawah itu.
Ini apa namanya? Karena oke.
Display
Bisa
setting
sekarang.
mungkin bisa.
Oke, all good. All good now?
Ya, sudah kelihatan.
Yeah, that's good now.
Terima
Yeah,
kasih.
thank you.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pak. I'm sorry, Pak. Yeah, thank you.
All good. Yeah. Okay. So, again, yeah, we have three different authorities, yeah, from the fiscal perspective. It's from the revenue side, from the budget allocation side, and then from the financing side. I already talked about the budget allocation. So now from the revenue side. So the government very concerned, have very strong concern in supporting the issue of climate change. So we provide some tax incentives so far. First is on the tax holiday for pioneering industry, tax allowance for renewable energy sectors, and we have different kinds of exemption. First on the VAT from on the import duty, and also we provide different kind of incentives to the regional government. From the financing, we may provide some innovative financing to also support the issue of climate change in Indonesia. The first is the green sukuk. I think this is one of the initiative from the government that very well recognized globally. We have maybe our green sukuk as the first green sukuk in global that is dedicated for supporting the investment in climate change, yeah, both for the mitigation and adaptation. So the data collected from the climate budget taking was used to collect the underlying assets to issue the green sukuk. And the second one is the initiative to establish what the so-called as the Environmental Fund Agency or Badan Pengelola Dana Lingkungan Hidup BPDLH, which is aimed to support conservation and environmental management, biodiversity management, and addressing the impact of climate change. And the Ministry of Finance also have PT Sarana Multi Infrastructure, who has SDG Indonesia 1, which is a blended finance platform to support also the issue of environmental, including the climate change. And Ministry of Finance is the NDA Secretariat for the Green Climate Fund in Indonesia. And as we already know that the GCF is one body under the UNFCCC, if I'm not mistaken, that providing some financial support in tackling the climate change in different countries. And then we have different kinds discussion related to the carbon pricing policy, where we may look at the carbon pricing as an opportunity to address the climate change financing gap, because we know that the carbon pricing also comprises of at least two different mechanisms, the marketing or the market mechanism and the non-market mechanism. And the carbon tax or levies is one of potential tools to be implemented under the carbon pricing policy. And we also perceive that carbon pricing is one of a potential source of the revenue revitalization. And we also think that there is a potential to internalize cost of cost externality because of the environmental aspect of some for any environmental aspect, yeah, of the carbon. And this may provide some opportunity to apply the polluters pay principle. And we expect that the application of carbon pricing may also encourage the more or broader green investment in Indonesia. And of course, it will be expected to promote the sustainable growth in the future. There is that today the carbon pricing policy is still under discussion from different relevant ministries, and the Ministry of Finance considers that the arrangements of related levies on carbon can be made broader to accommodate the possibility of implementing existing levies instrument and open up opportunities to create new instruments in the future. So we may utilize what we have so far, but we can apply the existing levies to apply for the carbon application in the future. And even though we have no what the so-called as the carbon tax, because the term tax itself will enforce that we need to have a different kind of law to be enacted. So then we consider that the existing tax or existing levies can be implemented to support the issue of carbon in Indonesia. So, however, we have existing taxes that considers to be have or dealing with any environmental aspect. The first is on luxury tax. We waive for the sale of low emissions vehicles, and it will be implemented by the end of this year. And in the regional level, we have what the so-called as the vehicle tax and also property tax. This is a different kind of tax that already may be considered to be carbon related tax in Indonesia. We also have different. If you may want to discuss further on the imposition of the green taxes, or then we have different kind of taxes that also dealing with any environmental taxes. And we also currently we are conducting a study on potential implementation of the carbon levy in Indonesia, and the initial analysis on the existing conditions in Indonesia and also the leading practices on designing carbon levy shows that Indonesia needs to achieve a set of strategic objectives to design a carbon levy. The potential identified strategic plans are the first is by creating an enabling environment, and designing a sound carbon levy system, and then initiating an effective implementation, as well as conducting a comprehensive reviewing of the existing system. And we perceive that the potential enabling conditions is called, the first is the conducting continuous and effective multi-stakeholder forum and stakeholders engagement, because introducing a new kind of levies or tax will need a strong support from different stakeholders for sure, and will be very noisy if I may say about that. And to enable more better conditions, so then we need conducting effective awareness raising and outreach among different stakeholders for sure. And then within carbon levy, within the existing levy or tax legal and administrative system, this is something that I already mentioned before, aligning carbon levy policy with other public policies, including fiscal policy, business, climate, and energy policies. And we need to also conscious about the impacts of the implementation of the carbon levy in Indonesia. We need to set clear object and targets of carbon levy, as well as design robust system in MRV as the result of the carbon levy application. And also we need to, of course, always enhance the capacity building and knowledge sharing among institutions, human, technical, and financial capacity. And this is the opportunity and challenges of the potential implementation of carbon levy. The opportunity is to possibly to revitalize sources of revenue for sure, and encourage the development of environmentally friendly investment, to support the achievement of emission reduction target, as already mentioned before, and also regulation on carbon pricing can support the carbon-related tax or levies policy. But the challenges remains there. A proper study is needed to analyze any technical issues and explore the potential consequences or impacts of the application of the carbon tax or levies on the economy, and a different impact expected. Alignment of related regulation and policies, of course, this is quite challenges, and conducting effective awareness raising and outreach, and also the capacity building. So given that opportunities, the carbon tax is perceived to be important for Indonesia for sure, but there are challenges that need to be addressed for its implementation. And in-depth study and different analysis is needed to support the implementation plan and to measure the potential impact from various aspects. And of course, the formulation of carbon pricing policies that are currently being discussed is expected to promote carbon emission reductions and for further design of carbon taxes or levies in the future. That's all from me. Thank you. And I give it back to Mbak Tara. Yeah, thank you, Mbak.
Thank you, Pak Nur. Yeah, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, Pak Nur reiterated that climate change is a global issue, and that Indonesia has a strong commitment to address this issue. And Indonesia commits to reduce carbon emission by implementing fiscal policy reform on three sides or three prongs: the revenue, budget, and climate finance. And specifically for climate finance, Indonesia plans to implement a carbon pricing mechanism, although this policy is now under discussion between relevant ministries. And this policy is expected to increase revenues for Indonesia. We now move on to the next speaker in this first session. The next speaker is Pak Andi, or Pak Bagus Agung Rahadiansyah. And Pak Andi later we'll talk about from the industrial perspective. So industrial perspective on carbon tax implementation. Pak Andi was graduated from Faculty of Economy, University Indonesia, majoring in financial management. He brings along 23 years of experience in banking and financial market. Before joining Pertamina as SVP Corporate Finance, he had completed various positions and roles from Director Head of Investor Sales, Structuring and Trading from reputable institutions such as ANZ Bank, Citibank, HSBC, Bank International Indonesia, and PT Dana Reksa Persero. And he was actively participating and organizing in various forums and financial industry organizations that made him interact closely with the Central Bank of Indonesia, the Bank Indonesia, the Ministry of Finance, the FSA or the OJK, and other prominent institutions. Pak Andi, for 15 to 20 minutes, I believe. The screen is yours, Pak.
Thank you. Ibu Prita. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Greeting from Jakarta, from Indonesia, to all the speakers from abroad. So I hope everyone always in healthy and good conditions, and hope we can all enjoy this pandemic time safely. Thank you for the opportunity, for an invitation for Pertamina to share our thought in this very important and so interesting topics about this carbon tax. And so allow me to share our screen and our presentation here.
Andy, but before that, Pa, I would like to make some correction. It's not 15 to 20 minutes. It is 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you,
Okay.
Andy.
No problem, Brita. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, Pa.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this discussion, I mean, this material is coming from a company that perhaps most of you will think that a brown company that going to say things around the carbon tax, but we do have our spirit along and aligned with the global community about the environment concerns on climate change, basically. So here, allow us to present our thought. So basically, as a Pertamina, as a state-owned oil and gas company, and we are the leading in Indonesian national oil and gas. We are mandated by our government to build and also to lead the safeguard of the Indonesia energy sustainability. Here we often use the jargon, the energy sustainability and also energy sovereignty, because as a nation we are in the process of building and developing our nations towards the better state and better welfare. Hence, the need for energy definitely will be very huge. And at the same time, basically, the government also aim to improve the economy stability, right, by implementing a lot of measures across the economy aspects. And one of them is also to reduce its current account deficits. So by having these two things, you can see for the time being, the utilization and optimization of our local resources has become priority. And by that, it means it largely still consists of the fossil fuel for the time being, because that's what our country provide. And although we try to export for others, and the government also support it. However, this exercise, this initiative is basically aligned also with the government long-term national energy general plan, where going forward in the long term, the usage of fossil fuel to fulfill our energy needs in our development will reduce to only around 28.7% of final energy needs by 2050. Pertamina is, as a company, we fully aware of the massive use of fossil fuel contributes significantly to the global warming and the climate change. So with this changes, with all this global initiative, I mean, Pertamina supports all the government programs in emission reductions, and also all the global community initiative that we follow, basically to prevent the global warming. So by that spirit, our company basically has started some initiative to help reduce our contribution of making this climate change worse by doing it starting from ourselves. If you can see, we have a lot of initiatives done within Pertamina. One of them, we call it the Pertamina Blue Sky Project, where we in our refineries, we produce more environmental friendly fuels, such as those that qualify or follow the certificate of like the Euro 4. And we are in the process of getting the next certification for our RDMP Balikpapan to obtain the Euro 5 certification by 2023. And also by doing that, we try to find other source of energy, source of power generations to supply our business units, where we proudly say we already have done to some of our business unit where they have additional electricity needs. We fulfill it using our solar panels. It has been done in our Badak units, Badak 3, Atap, and Dumai, Cilacap, Semike, and also in Java 1 project. Not to mention, we also already looking to going forward, even for our gas stations, we will try to reduce the need of the usage of electricity from the fossil-based power generations. So going forward, it's our gas station gradually will migrate using solar panels and batteries for its electricity needs. On top of it, we also, perhaps some of you also know that we have this, we call the Pertamina Geothermal Energy, where they are our backbone and our spearhead to explore and build more assets and in purpose to support power generation using the geothermal. This geothermal basically is in the ESG concept or in the ESG context, they call it this as dark green asset, dark green energy. So we proudly say that this is one of our future for our power generations. In terms of business itself, we also having this business unit, we call it the Pertamina Power Indonesia, where the mandate from our shareholders, meaning from the government, from our shareholders, and also from our management, to always explore continuously for more and more green, new renewable energy projects. We talking about green powers, the potential for wind farms, the development participation in the battery industry for the future electronic vehicles, and a lot of others. So what we can see here also, the government of Indonesia also very supportive in this area. As my team find that there's tax incentive provided by the government to those projects that promote the renewable energy. So there will be like tax holiday, tax allowance, more things like that. So with this, from Pertamina ourselves as a company, and we are reshaping our company from just a simple oil and gas company towards the energy company. So we try to diversify our energy needs and also power generation, not just from the traditional fossil fuel, but already going to other alternative energy that we can source. This means we are preparing our business ahead to anticipate the change of this energy consumption trend. And going more and more going forward, people will have more concern, more more by spirit to go green, to support for the climate change prevention. So here we are at Pertamina. We already started it by doing it ourselves. In terms of going to the basically the carbon tax itself, I mean, to be honest, we made aware of this discussion perhaps already some years back. I mean, there was a discussion about the possibility of implementing of this carbon tax to the oil and gas or even to other industries. I think probably 2014 or even maybe longer than that. But so far, yeah, we haven't received or get the firm guideline yet. But without that, we as a company, we managed to do our own exercise and initiative in support for this reducing our carbon footprint, basically. In terms of study, yeah, like I said earlier, I mean, since it's not yet put as a firm framework, so we haven't had any full study yet by Pertamina, right? And to see the impact of this carbon tax to our traditional business. I mean, the magnitude of the impact to our fossil related business. But here we try to relate the context of our discussions and also with the studies that we can, I mean, our team can find, and also the condition that we see from Pertamina perspective. So we got some studies that we can refer to, basically like since the Industrial Revolution back in 18th centuries in Europe and in Northern Hemisphere. Basically, the use of this fossil fuel has been very massive, and this has increased, right? The magnitude by years exponentially. But then, from those process, it creates this we call the negative externalities, which in the form of the increased air pollutions, and later it leads to the global warming and ultimately may cause this the disastrous climate change if we fail to stop it. So we think, and one of the many ways of combating this climate change can be done through many aspects, many ways, many measures. But in this case, when we talk about the tax policy implementations that may help to reduce such effect, it can be formed in terms of tax incentive or tax burden, right? So we believe that this carbon tax may be one of the effective instrument in as part of government intervention to limit or to reduce the use of the fossil fuel and reducing the negative externalities in the long run. This is just a simple the demand supply relation from the application of the carbon tax. But what I try to give a note here, basically, one is yes, a carbon tax is possibly a good solution, although may not be perfect, like the previous speaker has mentioned, that there are aspects that need to be considered carefully. There are aspects on the technicalities that need to be planned comprehensively. Because in Indonesia, I mean, what I can share basically, it's this graph showing an ideal graph of condition of demand and supply. But perhaps other speakers or other experts can add. In Indonesia, this demand and supply of energy, especially this the largely as a fossil fuel energy, is likely leaning towards more inelastic rather than an elastic nature, meaning it may impact to some extent, but for Indonesians, the increase of oil price or increase of fuel price not necessarily will drop the demand by significant amount, because what I can observe is basically one is we don't have yet a real replacement energy of choice if such energy fuel is got carbon tax. That's one. And the second one, in the Indonesia economy, there's also the informal sectors where this fuel is part of their cost of production. I mean, this household industry, they simply or some the two-wheelers, taxi driver, where this fuel is, whether you tax it or not, they have to buy. So unless we can find a replacement or of this energy alternative, that would be one of the also a key success point to make this happen. And we also want to emphasize from our perspective here that, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, that as a spirit of a long-term goal, we do believe that this carbon tax may provide a good alternative to be explored further as part of the initiative and measures to prevent this climate change, right? We basically, as a company, we will follow the direction and guidelines from the Indonesian government regarding this the tax implementation and the reference that we can follow. I mean, I noticed that in the beginning the speakers mentioned about how this had been done for so long and successfully in the Nordic area, in the Scandinavia area. So it is very good and inspiring. But yeah, again, this implementation of a carbon tax need to be applied gradually and prudent for Indonesia, because preferably it should not cause an adverse effect when such tax is applied or imposed. Instead of giving a value add from the deployment of the tax itself, but it ended up only becoming a higher cost of economy. That would basically will burden to the lower income class society, where they are largely still consuming this carbon fuel. I mean, they don't have choice. I mean, they still need to use it. And what we can see and share here basically as the transmission of the carbon tax policy implication, as mentioned earlier, must be assessed comprehensively. So to the welfare compensation impact must be equal. I mean, if it's not possible to be bigger than the deadweight loss that created, especially the impact to the lower income segments, because that would be the main impact, which I believe, I'm not going to go to that area, but that would be not like politically popular, but with a good thing, educations and transmission of the impact of the tax that made it real to this particular segment, I do believe this will help a lot.
Right.
And
Andy,
yeah,
if we may wrap up your presentation, Pak.
yeah. So yeah, basically in short, it's, from the presentation, it's basically we Pertamina we follow and we support the measures to reduce this carbon emission to help the climate change prevention, but the carbon tax implementation will need to be assessed thoroughly from industry perspective, which may short-termly will impact the profitability and also the cost, and also from the social perspective, as the consumer on the lower income will be the most impacted on this matter. I think that will be all, Ibu Prita. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Pak Andi. I think your last statement pretty much already summarized the presentation. We're very glad to hear that Pertamina supports the government program in emission reduction and global community initiative to prevent warming. But we also do realize that there are a lot of things that still needs to be done, and that we would like to congratulate you that you have started some green project and initiatives. And even though you reiterated and mentioned that it is important to have the availability of alternative or substitute to fossil fuel.
Yes.
Pak Andi. Thank you very much, Pak Andi.
Thank
And
you.
now we're off to the final speaker for the first session. The final speaker for this session is Pak Firman Tatarianto, PhD. Pak Tatarianto is the acting head of Mapping and Assessment Development Section, Directorate of Business Process Transformation, Directorate General of Taxes, Ministry of Finance, Republic of Indonesia, of course. And Pak Dr. Tatarianto has been awarded as doctoral degree on environmental taxation from Asia Pacific Studies, Waseda University, Japan. He is currently an acting head of mapping, which I have stated earlier, at the Ministry of Finance, Republic of Indonesia. Pak Dr. Firman Tatarianto. Saya persilahkan, Pak. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mbak Prita. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think previous speakers already discussed all about the carbon tax. And let me, in my sessions, will be discussed further about the policy mix. So possible policy mix. So let me share my presentations first. Okay, here we go. Okay, hopefully the presentations are already available in your screens. So in my presentations, actually, Pak Nur already discussed all the Ministerial Finance policies or Indonesia's policy regarding the carbon tax and about the green economy. So I will take this presentation further to like elaborate and the feasibility of the policy mix implementations on the environmental tax in the case of land and forest fire. So I will take this policy mix in the context of handling the case of land and forest fire. I will talk about more detail on the next slide. Right, so I will discuss on this presentation about the emission profile, articulating tax policy in the land and forest fires, and then also the policy make implementations. Right, so this is also already discussed by Pak Nur, basically about the Indonesian emission profile. I just want to give the glance or more details about the green side, the green on the graph. The green is LUCF, land use and land use change and forestries. So actually these parts beside the energy sectors will be one of the greatest emissions emitted area that should be tackled. So based on the report from APERC is almost if we just downgraded the peat fires and land and forest fire, basically, it will be reduced 25 to 10, I think 23 to 45% about the emissions profile. So in NDC, so basically we in Indonesian NDC basically will be reduced in 29% in 2030. One of not one, two of the point will be effective land use change and spatial planning, also restoring function of degraded ecosystems. So this area may be one of the area that we can take the environmental tax to support and also put it on the context on the policy mix. Why we talk about policy mix in the first place, actually, wait, right. Some studies say that no one have the single policy to take all. So it seems like in the text, no one tax policy will be handle all the problems in the world. Actually, that will be not happening actually. So the policy mix will be considering about command control, how to combine the command controls or other policy measures in the environmental policies with instrument in the economic instruments. And one particularly, I will take the audience to see well in the implementations on enforcement areas. That will be I will present afterwards. So this is about the how the effectiveness of the enforcements if we put it together about the policy measure that's now actually is usually on the box ourselves, like environmental policy will be do the enforcement by themselves, and tax or economic instrument will be usually like left behind or something like that. Okay, let more detail about it. So how do we articulate the policy mix is put it on the tax policy on the post on deterrent-based enforcement. Basically, the deterrence-based enforcement is on the part of regulatory policy or the part of command controls policies, where our fine and detections basically will be expected to internalize uh, the harm of the process externalities in the systems. Right. So before we going through about the mix, the proof of the mix, the evidence of the mix policy, we talk about first about how the regulatory policy have been done in the case of land and forest fires. So you see on these tables is on the hotspot area. So basically, this is like common sense in Indonesia. So almost repeated burning is happening in on the graph of in the area of concessions of the companies in the HU or UPHHK. So they are repeated burning almost 82% in the 3 years or and 44%, 45%. Okay, and that how the regulatory enforcement tackle these issues to handle the land and forest fires burning actually, how they handle this. We have instruments, we have criminal acts, we have environmental protection management act, and then also plantation acts and also on. And the left side of the tables, we can see that most of the environmental harm as agrarian factors is only 38 to adding 48, only 76, sorry, 86 cases related to environmental harm. So the judge is stated as is environmental harm cases, but the other 34 cases would be left as not as environmental harm. So basically, so how about the ratio fine multiple? Ratio fine multiple is the ratio between the fine and the ecological recovery cost. Ecological recovery cost is the cost that's stated by expert witness to calculate how much the cost needed to restore the environmentals. And we can see only 0.004, which is 0.4% that will be recovered on this side of on the criminals process of regulatory enforcements. Also, if we divide it between Sumatra and Kalimantan Island, we can see the differences between the both islands. What more interesting is if we put it in the context of the background of defendants. Why I put it this context? Because I want to show that on the context of regulatory enforcement, some area or some people, some actor that responsible to these conditions is left behind. Actually, they may have criminalized, but actually they don't pay anything. This area that need that economic instruments will be put it to tackle these issues. So if we go through the plantation company in this area, they have ecological recovery costs based on the court judgment is 1 trillion, but actually the fines is much less than that. It's only 0.4%. But if we go to the people that don't have the economic capability, actually they have much higher. So basically they pay more for the crime they did, actually, in the case of land and forest fire. So these people that are the area that need, we more strengthen the enforcement to give them more punishment to change their behavior. Actually, if we only base on regulatory enforcement, actually they will miss the area. So basically they will just skip it and doing this thing all over again. I will happy to discuss about it if more detail about it, these areas. Okay, this is the effectiveness of mix. If we calculate how much the effectiveness of mix policies, if we put it tax context, enforcement in tax context, and then we get the marginal effects of fine and tax, it's very significant in statistic. So it goes to 0.3 minus for fine. It means that 1 unit increase in fines comprehensively with interaction with the tax enforcements actually will reduce mostly 0.505% of the hotspot in these regions. Hotspot is part of kilometer per squares in this area. So this hypothetically can say that mixed policy will be available and will be uh, done to reduce the hotspot. But currently, this is not happening. This is like feasibility in the future, hypothetically. Right. So how can with this hypothetically will be possible mixed pollution in the implementations? One is about the joint effect through combination of fine leverage as part of environmental enforcement and tax enforcement as fiscal capacity measures. So this is part of in global context. It's not on the only on the land and forest fires, but if put it in the land and forest fires, if we just see on the law number 29 and law number 39 in 2014, we have to put it actually, we have to put it in this law how we can say the economic instrument about ecological recovery costs as part of state receivable that we can take them from the company or the economic agents that have the burning by intentions. Refer to government regulations 46 in 2007. Actually, we have the government regulation instruments, government regulation that rules about the economic instruments in the environmental, but how this in government regulation will be put it in place with others measures in environmental protections law that will be need to be elaborate more. And then the second part will be the possible shift for regular tax and environmental related tax. Like Pak Nur previously stated that we have environmental related tax. Usually this put it on the, how can I say, regional tax. So it's put it on the regional based tax. Uh, also in the central government tax, but it put it on the VAT firm, VAT and income tax, a final income tax. But how can this put it on the context of a land and forest fires? That will be if we want to be mixed. If we put it this area with the land and building and land and building tax (LBT) for plantation, mining, and forestry sectors in the context of land and forest fires. So how can we do that? By increasing sales value of taxable objects. So NGOPs in Indonesian terms. So we have to put it the value of the burning. So because if we know that the previous study stated that or only 40%, the difference between the burning using the sustainable burning and the burning using the fires, how to clear land, to clear the plantations or the put it the plantation in the first place, it will be 40%. So it's quite higher. So 40% for the palm oil plantations and 70% for the forestry sectors. So how we see that they have a more economic choice to put it on the fires because they know that this is more profitable for them. So that way, one of the most possible things if we put it in the context of a land and building tax in the put it on the forestry, mining, and plantation sectors. And then also stated in the first speaker about the revenue neutral swap. This is also happening that if we not put it in the context of environmental tax reform, that we we improve all uh, the tax models, not only on the local government and central government tax environmental related tax, then will be fail in the context of hypothetically, because they just in the current context of tax usually uh, based on the law, this only based to generating the revenue. We just miss the area to preserve the environmental. So that's why we need to improve like government regulation 78 in 2009, like our previous speaker stated about the facilities. The tax facilities not only the for the company or the people that have related to workforce, but also related to environmental products and also sustainable process. And then
Pak
also
Firman?
in article, yep.
If I
Sorry?
may, Pak Firman, to ask
Okay.
you to kindly wrap up, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. One more thing. So what about the critical issues? So the critical issues will be the building institutional capacities because mixed enforcement is need understanding between this Minister of Finance and other ministries, and also policy interactions actually. So, and then political support. This will be challenging because we put it on the context of environmental tax reforms. We need to also measure the considers about the regulations, government regulation for the second in 2017. And then this is hoped by our ministers, Bu Sri Mulyani, about how will be more sustainable for Indonesia if fiscal policy used as catalyst low carbon development and boosting the capacity of national climate change financings and also increasing the disaster resilience and climate change. This also already discussed by Pak Nur. I think that's all for my presentations. Thank you. Return to you, Mbak Prita. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Firman. Thanks so much. You mentioned that environmental mixed tax policy is indeed possible for Indonesia, but it does need supports from the government and regional government. And also further studies are expected, not to mention that Indonesia has a massive forest. And indeed, we have several forest fire in Indonesia, and the largest one last year is in Kalimantan, right, Pak? Thank you, Pak. And so that was, ladies and gentlemen, that was the first session of the webinar. And now we move on to the second session. The first session was more on the Indonesian perspective. And now for the second session, we'll look at the international perspectives on green taxation policy and implications for Indonesia. So how does the international society or community sees that for Indonesia? And we only have two speakers for this session. The first one is Mr. Paul Berg, PhD. And I would like to remind participants that we will have a Q&A at the end of all speakers. So Mr. Berg, Dr. Berg, is an associate professor and head Arndt Gordon Department of Economics, Australian National University. And he will talk about the emissions reductions from carbon pricing, talking from the international evidence. Paul Berg is, yes, and he is also the lead researcher within Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific ANU Grand Challenge Project. He is on the executive committee for the Australasian Development Economics Workshop and convenes the H.W. Arndt Lecture. Dr. Berg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And may I please be given permission for screen sharing? Currently, I'm not able to share my screen. I can talk without slides, but I'll just wait one moment.
Bang John, yeah. Pak John, can you please make Dr. Paul Berg as the co-host? Thank you.
Now you can share your screen, sir.
Okay, well, hi everyone, and hi from Canberra in Australia. My name is Paul, and I'm today just looking from a more international perspective on carbon pricing, and in particular looking at the emissions reductions that come from carbon pricing based on international evidence. Carbon pricing is still not in place in many countries. However, it is becoming more popular. This graph was from The Economist last year, and it shows that the percentage of emissions globally covered by a carbon price is increasing. A carbon price can either be some type of emissions trading scheme, ETS, or can be from a carbon tax or some other type of similar scheme, for example, a hybrid. Over the years, more and more countries have been adopting a carbon price. Initially, it was Sweden and Finland and other Northern European countries. However, more recently, then we can start to add more countries, for example, South Africa and Singapore. And this graph goes all the way to 2021. In 2021, the big news is that China will start its national emissions trading scheme. Currently, 46 countries have a national or subnational carbon pricing scheme. So if you add up all of the countries with some type of carbon pricing, you get to 46, including Indonesia's neighbor, Singapore. Most European countries have a carbon price, and it's becoming more popular in Asia also. Japan has a carbon tax and has emissions trading schemes in Tokyo and Saitama. South Korea has an emissions trading scheme. China will have a national emissions trading scheme this year. And some other countries, including developing countries like South Africa. South Africa has a carbon tax. Countries like the United States, that's an example where there are some subnational carbon pricing schemes. So for example, California in the United States has a carbon price. However, some other states do not have a carbon price yet in the US. Altogether, 46 countries. in our research, we asked one very simple question. How effective has carbon pricing been in reducing CO2 emissions? And we focused on emissions from the energy sector. So that means electricity, transport, industrial use of energy, and so on. Why the energy sector? Well, globally, it accounts for about 80% of CO2 emissions. What we did is in our project, we published 2 papers quite recently, just in the recent times. The first paper is looking at the effect of carbon pricing on CO2 emissions from the energy sector. And the second paper is looking at the effect of carbon pricing on the mix of energy types which is used by each country. And these are cross-country international studies looking at using data for as many countries as possible. And the data set does include Indonesia, but Indonesia does not have a carbon price. Today, I just want to introduce briefly some results and then have a brief discussion of Indonesia. In this study, we present the first large sample international study. So our sample covers about 140 countries, 142 countries. We used econometric statistical techniques, and really what we are trying to do is look at the effect of, if we control for many things, what is the effect of carbon pricing? Do countries with a carbon price have slower growth in emissions or reductions in emissions? I could talk about the method, and also I'm happy to share the paper with anyone who's interested. The paper is available online, or else please email me, I'll send you a copy. Empirical results. We find that when we look across countries and we control for many other things, including other policy differences between countries. For example, policies relating to energy efficiency, fuel tax, and other things. We find that the effect of carbon pricing is quite noticeable. On average, countries with a carbon price have a growth rate of CO2 emissions per annum, which is about 2 percentage points lower. This is the annual CO2 emissions growth rate. That's controlling for all other factors, many other factors. So that's quite a big effect. For example, instead of emissions growing at 2% per annum, then if there's a carbon price in place, we would expect emissions to grow at about 0% per annum. That's the type of effect from the average size carbon price that is applied internationally. One other thing we find is that higher carbon prices lead to quicker emissions reductions from business as usual. So what we find is that an additional euro per ton CO2 in carbon price, on average, it reduces the annual CO2 emissions growth rate by about 0.3 percentage points. So if you have a carbon price already and you increase it by €1 per ton CO2, then that increase would help to reduce the CO2 emissions growth rate relative to what it would have been without that price increase. We tried to compare, is there a difference between the effect of a carbon tax and an ETS? We don't find anything interesting. Both of these two approaches are seemingly highly effective in reducing emissions from the energy sector. And we can look at cases like Sweden for examples. In the Asia-Pacific region, there has been a lot of recent progress in climate policy. In particular, last year, the major announcements for transitions to climate neutrality in China and net zero in Japan and South Korea. These are huge announcements over coming decades. If the announcements are to be kept, then the economies of these countries will change radically in terms of their energy systems and their other emissions from other sectors as well. China's national ETS is planned to cover about 1,700 emitters starting in the power sector. Some other news is that Vietnam has passed a revised law on environmental protection, which has now legalized the introduction of an emissions trading scheme. So perhaps in the next coming years, Vietnam will have some progress there in terms of introducing an emissions trading scheme. So the region is moving quite quickly, and there are many opportunities for zero carbon energy in Indonesia and in other countries in the region. For example, Indonesia's neighbor, Singapore, it has introduced a Singapore $5 per ton CO2 carbon tax as of about 2 years ago. The tax covers about 80% of national greenhouse gas emissions, and that rate might be increased in coming years. They're planning to review the tax rate in 2023. It's still too early to evaluate the effect of this tax. In the first year of implementation, emissions did reduce. However, it is still too early. We need to see the effectiveness of it. But nevertheless, we should have a strong expectation that emissions will be lower with the carbon price in place relative to the case that there was no carbon price. Just a couple more slides and then I'll finish. Some conclusions from our empirical research. We find that carbon pricing is effective. We find evidence that countries with carbon prices, they have faster transitions to cleaner energy, including solar and wind and some other types of clean energy as well, and away from highly polluting energy types such as coal, oil, and also natural gas. Also, countries with carbon prices have emissions reductions relative to what we would expect without the carbon price. Higher carbon prices are associated with larger emissions reductions relative to business as usual. How about the case of Indonesia? And Indonesia is a country I've visited many times and carried out many projects, and always love visiting Jakarta and elsewhere in Indonesia, and cannot wait to come back again after COVID situation improves a bit. Carbon pricing is one of the most important economic reforms that Indonesia could possibly introduce. Carbon pricing is a very effective way for Indonesia to meet one of its key national objectives, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon pricing has also been discussed for a long time in Indonesia, with the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia releasing a green paper on carbon pricing more than 1 decade ago. One key feature of carbon pricing is that it would help Indonesia to tackle one of its most important problems, which is local air pollution, especially in large cities such as Jakarta, where commonly the air quality index moves into dangerous levels. An advantage of carbon pricing is that it brings local benefits by helping to switch towards lower emissions energy and lower emissions processes. One other characteristic of Indonesia's economy is that the tax to GDP ratio is very low. And there are some clear benefits really from increasing that ratio, so that there will be more resources available for provision of public goods and for investment in things like education and health. So carbon pricing is one of the mechanisms which could help to reach that goal. And that also is a goal within Indonesia as well. In Indonesia, the most desirable approach, and this is true elsewhere from my point of view and my recommendation as an economist, is to go for a carbon tax or levy. This can be designed in a very simple way, simply as an upstream levy on oil, natural gas, and coal products. The exact coverage and the exact rules need to be designed, but in principle, this is not a very difficult tax to collect. And it's much easier in a country like Indonesia to collect carbon tax revenue than it would be to collect income tax revenue, for example. Why is that? There are many millions of income earners. However, the number of companies that are large fossil fuel suppliers is relatively low. So the number of taxpayers for a carbon tax or a carbon levy would be much lower than for many other types of tax, such as income tax. So from many points of view, ease of tax collection, increasing tax share of GDP, reducing local air pollution problems, and meeting the emissions reduction commitment of Indonesia and contributing to global climate change mitigation, carbon pricing is a very good idea, and that's why many economists consistently do recommend carbon pricing. Thank you very much, and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Berg. I think the last slide was the perfect summary to your presentation, and it was interesting to learn that there are 46 countries currently have a national or subnational carbon pricing scheme, and that it can be associated for faster transition to clean energy and emission reduction, especially for Indonesia. Where it can help reduce pollution and increase GDP that could be more directed toward public goods, education, and health and whatnot. Thank you very much. And the last but not least, the speaker for the second session is Ms. Jacqueline Cottrell from Green Fiscal Policy Consultant, Green Budget, Germany. And Ms. Jacqueline she collaborates with a wide range of international organizations, including GIZ, AFD, United Nations institutions or bodies, such as UNEP, UNESCAP, UNOSD, UNITAR. I hope the interpreters are getting this right. The AFD, IEA, RATD, IISD, VIDC, and the German Development Institute, or the DIE. Jacqueline specializes in environmental fiscal policy, green budgeting, and inclusive green economy policies, and delivers advisory, capacity development, and research, mainly in low and middle income countries. She is a freelance associate at FOS and formerly Vice President of Green Budget Europe. Ms. Cottrell, the screen is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Eva Prita, for your kind introduction. I will share my screen. Bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So thank you very much to ISD for the invitation, and thank you very much to all the previous speakers. It's quite a hard act to follow, I feel, after the excellent and really interesting inputs and contributions today, but I will do my best simply to highlight a few areas which I think might be interesting for the discussion, and not to dwell too much on points that have already been made by previous speakers this afternoon. So I'd like to talk briefly about the political economy of green fiscal policy and green recovery in Indonesia. The structure of my presentation will be really, first of all, to look at some myth busting very briefly, talk about a couple of misconceptions associated with carbon taxation in particular, and then look at some opportunities for green fiscal policy in the Indonesian context. So first of all, I'd like to use this slide, which actually I stole from Kurt van Dender from the OECD, who made this presentation at the Global Conference on Environmental Taxation a couple of years ago. What he did was show very clearly in one slide how well the carbon tax in Australia actually worked. You can see it was introduced in June 2012, the first blue line there on the slide, on electricity. And we can see that emissions from the electricity sector fell quite rapidly to the point where the tax was withdrawn again in June 2014, and emissions once again started to rise. We heard a lot of evidence already from the previous speaker, so I won't dwell on this any further, but simply a very simple graph to show that a carbon price can really make a difference to greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. And secondly, just to look at the impact of a carbon tax on per capita income. What you can see here on this graph is the income effect of a $30 carbon tax on the lowest income group relative to the national average in 87 countries where the modeling was done. And if the value is lower than 1, so that's green, then that indicates a progressive outcome. What that means is that if a carbon tax is introduced, the impact will be higher on higher income groups. It doesn't indicate that there will be no impact on the lowest income group, and it doesn't indicate that there shouldn't be very careful social welfare measures introduced to target compensation or protection to the lowest income groups. But what it does indicate, and I think this is quite an important point, is that typically a carbon tax will have a greater impact on those on higher incomes. And that's what we can see here. And we can see also on this graph that Indonesia is light green, so the income effect also in Indonesia can be expected to be progressive. And now on to a few opportunities, which I'd like to look at very quickly. First of all, Noor already talked quite a lot about the existing policy framework that's in place to introduce green taxes in Indonesia. So I don't think I need to say very much about this. Perhaps just to highlight that there is a framework in place already for green fiscal policies. Some are already in place, some are in preparation. There are also very many presidential which we could also use to implement a carbon tax or a carbon levy or other environmental fiscal instruments in the Indonesian context, both at national level and subnational level. And we can see as well that there's a possibility to continue ongoing measures to reform fossil fuel subsidies. Indeed, Indonesia's 2019 report to the G20 highlighted widespread support for that process to be continued. What you can see on this slide is some research done by the World Bank on the potential revenues from a carbon tax. This actually shows revenue from a carbon price of $70 per ton, rather than the rather lower level that perhaps will be introduced in Indonesia at first. But as it shows here, if Indonesia were to introduce this carbon price of $70, they could expect to raise about 2% of tax revenue as a proportion of GDP, which is a really substantial amount of revenue, which could be used for policy priorities as necessary. Of course, in the context of Indonesia, where we can see that there's a very low tax to GDP ratio of about 12%, I think this potential to mobilize domestic revenue using a carbon tax could be very important in the Indonesian case and would create some opportunities to increase tax revenue altogether. It could also go some way to tackling the funding gap that we know Indonesia faces in terms of achieving its targets for climate change mitigation and adaptation. I think the Fiscal Policy Agency calculated in 2018 that probably funding availability amounted to about 34% of the total revenue needed to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. So we can see that perhaps mobilizing domestic revenue through a carbon tax could go some way to tackling this issue as well. And finally, we know that the carbon pricing gap, the gap between a conservative benchmark carbon price of about $35 per ton and the actual carbon price in Indonesia is very large. And as much as 84% of CO2 emissions are not priced at all. So we can see also there that there's a great deal of potential and space to increase the carbon tax. Furthermore, what we can see on this graph is that the oil price has risen since 2020, but it remains low. And that also creates an opportunity potentially to implement a carbon tax or a carbon price. In 2014-15, as I'm sure we all know, Indonesia instigated a process of reform of price regulations for transport fuels, and other countries were following a similar pattern at that time. In 2015, we can see in both Mexico and Chile a carbon tax was introduced. In Mexico also, excise on transport fuels was increased, and fossil fuel subsidies were reformed. So we can see in terms of the oil price, there's potential there as well. There's some space in the pricing of transport fuels to introduce, for example, a carbon levy or a carbon price outside the upcoming ETS sectors, for example. What we can also see in the case of Indonesia, which I think is very important, that Indonesia has a great deal of experience on revenue shifting from the fossil fuel subsidy reform that took place in 2014-15. We can see here very clearly on the graph, we can see how spending changed between spending on energy subsidies and spending on education, on infrastructure and on health. We can see here shown on the graph that there was a really strong change here. And I think this experience can really be something that Indonesia could draw on very well if they introduced a carbon levy in the coming years. And we can see here also, this is a bit more detail on the targeted social assistance that was used in Indonesia from 2015 to protect the vulnerable. So we can see there's the experience there. We can see that there are really well-constructed cash transfer systems which can be drawn on to protect the vulnerable from any increase in the price, for example, of transport fuels. And finally, one last point that I'd like to highlight before I come to a close is the importance of synergies between reducing CO2 emissions and reducing emissions that are harmful to human health. What this chart here shows is mortality, morbidity and welfare costs from exposure to ambient particulate matter in Australia, which is from fossil fuel combustion in the energy sector, also due to forest fires, peat fires. And we can see here that there's a huge impact in terms of the cost on health and the welfare cost, which has doubled from about 2.1%, about 1% of GDP equivalent in 1990 to about 2.1% GDP equivalent in 2017. So we can really see this as an urgent issue, which needs to be tackled. I'm sure everyone is aware of the lawsuit in Jakarta due to the problems of air pollution, and that actually the Indonesian capital is the most polluted capital city in the Asian region. So there are some really important co-benefits to be drawn on here from the introduction of a levy that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, but correspondingly also reduce emissions harmful to human health, and also therefore tackle this problem of mortality and morbidity from air pollution. And of course, in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, it's also important to think about the connection that seems to be established between higher rates of hospitalization and morbidity from the COVID-19 virus and regions where air pollution is very high, the concentrations are very high. There have been strong correlations found there as well. So there's another very important driving force and reason for the government to consider measures to tackle these issues together if possible and deliver win-win outcomes. So just very quickly onto my final slide, I decided to cite Mariana Mazzucato, her idea of a mission economy, the idea that governments really have a mission. They do more than just direct their economies from a low level, but they can express those deep commitments in the way that they tackle policy and the way that they go about shaping the economy that they want to see in the future. And I think what we've really seen today very strongly is that the Indonesian government is already deeply committed to climate change mitigation and environmental protection. We can see they're already a pioneer of green fiscal and financial policies, the Green Sukuk climate budget tagging, fossil fuel subsidy reform. I could go on. We know that we can expect green fiscal policies to deliver co-benefits, and the governments are really well placed at the moment with the opportunity created by the need to drive a recovery to make that recovery have a really clear direction. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion and your comments.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So Mission Green Fiscal Policy launched and hopefully accomplished in its time. Thank you very much. It's very great to hear that Indonesia is deeply committed, that it is the pioneer for green fiscal and financial policies. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are the presentation or the speakers for both the session 1 and session 2, and we don't have too much time for Q&A. But we do have time for Q&A, and we have selected a number of Q&A that have been addressed or delivered in the Q&A box, and the committee will help me to display those questions on the screen, please, so that I can read it out for the panelists. We'll directly begin so that we'll have more time. The first one is from Nadila Shani from the ASEAN Center for Energy, and this is to all panelists, and I will ask all panelists one by one to answer later. So what is the pros and cons of carbon taxing compared to ETS? Why Nordic countries are inclined to carbon taxing instead of ETS? And will implementation of carbon taxing influence the investment appetite in the country in the beginning, especially for developing country like Indonesia? I would like to start first with Tara, our host, as well as the first speaker who provided opening remark. Tara, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, I would like to remind the panelists to give answer for 1, maximum 2 minutes, please. Go ahead, Tara.
Hi. Yeah, look, I'm actually happy to defer to others on this issue. I think there are others more well qualified to answer this question. I'd only note that for some of the Nordics, it's not a question of a carbon tax or an ETS. I think that some of them are covered by the EU ETS as well as their own carbon taxes. But yeah, I'd really like to defer to Paul Weston in particular, who would understand more about the Swedish model, and Paul Burke on this as well.
Paul Weston?
Yeah, sure. No, it's not either or, it's both actually. So one of the pros of the trading scheme is that encompasses the industry and the power sector, and also then you have a common price in the European Union, and that protects also the competitiveness of the industries, while the carbon tax is more domestically set and can be set in accordance to political direction when it comes to revenue levels or social effects, etc. And on the second question, I think the investment appetite would be higher for renewables, for example, if you have a carbon levy or a carbon price. So that would be the good thing, and discourage investments in fossil fuels. That's my quick answer.
Thank you, Pak Weston. And I guess since this is a question to all panelists, our panelists from Indonesia, Pak Noor, Pak Andi, and Pak Firman will perhaps give a advice on the pros and cons of carbon taxing for Indonesia as opposed to ETS. Why carbon taxing and not ETS? I would like to call Pak Noor first to answer this question. Silakan, Pak Noor.
Yes, thank you, Mbak Prita. I think there is a quite interesting perception among the stakeholders that providing more tax means will give them a more burden to their capacity, which is if we may compare it with the trading system, then everyone seems to look at as an opportunity for them to earn something rather to cost more for them. This is the perception that are being I think yeah, this is my own opinion, that being perceived by kind of the stakeholders. So once for example, if the government like to introduce a new kind of tax, then it will be very, very noisy politically, and of course we need to also consider the direct and indirect impact of introduction of a new kind of tax. This is what we need to look at quite deep, but Rita. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you, Pak Nur. Pak Andi, Pak.
Yes, thank you, Bu Prita. Well, I'm not that so expert in this matter, but from my understanding about the ETS, it's the emission trading system, right? I mean, when we talk about trading system, it means that you will need more participants on both sides. I mean, the buyer and the sellers, and for that you will have to build the ecosystem or the environment first, right? I mean, so for Indonesia case, I think with the literacy, with the understanding, and with the current infrastructure for this carbon related measurements, I think a carbon tax will be much more straightforward and will be much more understandable and easier to implement once it's done on the studies. But for the long run, I believe when everybody already, and in Indonesia at least, we have this understanding all the functions or parts of this trading system, then might be good to look at the ETS going forward. But I think carbon tax will be the easier to implement for time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Andi and Pak Firman.
Okay, thank you. Actually, already discussed by other speakers, but I just want to add that in the ETS system, we actually have the schema Carbon Nusantara already put it as how can I prototype for the ETS. But as you know, that is not so easy to implement the ETS. Even the European Union have the problem to do the ETS. And again, even though we use the ETS, we have problem with also if the trading using the ETS moving beyond the borders, and then we have also taxation issue in there. International taxation issue will be in place also. So basically, if you use the ETS or carbon taxing, is depend on what the situation is on the country itself. If we do the ETS now, actually ASEAN countries may be not ready to do the ETS. But if we do the ETS in Japan or the context of China, Japan, on Korea, we may be more stable, and then we can do the ETS more to reduce the carbon emissions. I think that's for my opinions on these matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Firman and Dr. Berg, and Ibu Jacqueline. Perhaps you would emphasize on would implementing carbon taxing influence the investment appetite in the country, in Indonesia? Dr. Berg.
Well, on tax versus ETS, my recommendation in Indonesia, go for the tax, go for the carbon levy. It's much simpler. It avoids the transaction costs of the trading in an emissions trading scheme. But certainly in the long run, it's possible to introduce an ETS also. Exactly as summarized by previous speakers, it's possible to have both. But in short, tax and relax, introduce a small tax, and that will help to develop the system. In terms of investment incentives, the beauty of a carbon price is that suddenly it makes many green investments economic. So it incentivizes investing in solar and wind, in energy efficiency, and many emissions reduction projects. So we'd expect once a carbon price is introduced, that there'd be a lot of investment flowing into these green industries.
Okay, and Ibu Jacqueline?
I think I don't have anything to add to that. I agree. It would improve the investment climate, and I like tax and relax. I think it is true that it's a much simpler proposal to implement a tax in Indonesia than to think about creating an emissions trading system, which is very complex comparatively to administrate and to monitor as well.
Thank you. And for the next question, this is from Haryanto from Purnomo Yusgiantoro Center, addressed to specifically Mr. Paul Weston, but also to all panelists. How do you ensure that the carbon tax implemented won't adversely impact the vulnerable part of the society? So for instance, people with low income, as people in this group also tend to have lower carbon footprint, or they consume less, if you will. So over to you, Paul Weston.
Yeah, obviously, it's quite a big difference between between Sweden and Indonesia, or the Nordics and Indonesia, when it comes to social welfare systems, for example. But I think it was very neatly presented also by Jacqueline, and that the adverse effects of a carbon tax wouldn't be that large in general if introduced carefully, and that Indonesia also has good opportunities to support the vulnerable. In Sweden, we also lowered the income taxes for the lower income grades, for example. So that's one way, but obviously we also have a strong social welfare system for people in need. So.
And Pak Noor?
Yes, of course, since we have not yet implemented the carbon tax in our tax system, in our fiscal system, so then we will refer to the previous study that if we want to protect the introduction of a new kind of carbon tax or levies, we need to provide some support or earmark some part of the revenue to the impacted sectors. For sure, we need to support the more green investment allocation or something. And then we need to also, because Indonesia still have issue in terms of the low level of income people, so we need to also address this issue by maybe providing some support to this people, that maybe some part of the income generated from the introduction of the carbon levies should also go to these people. This is like to minimize the adverse impact of the introduction of, I think not just for the carbon tax or carbon levies, but also if there is any introduction of new kind of taxes or levies, then we need to also address this. That is my point.
Thank you, Pak Andi, and then later on Pak Firman and Dr. Berg, Jacqueline, as well as Tara. But first, Pak Andi.
Sorry, Mbak Prita, I couldn't hear clearly.
Yes, Pak. There was a question directed to all panelists, Pak. The question is, how do you ensure that the carbon tax implemented won't adversely impact the vulnerable part of the society? Because Indonesia, we know that we have quite a number of low-income people, Pak Andi.
Yeah, perhaps the economic experts here more capable, but my notes probably on this question is like I mentioned in my presentation, that that will be one of the key aspect when we want to implement this carbon tax in Indonesia, because this the transmission of that from that tax to the benefit of this vulnerable or the impacted segments, the most impacted segments basically, will be crucial to from economic perspective, also from perhaps political perspective, but I'm not going to do that way, but more to the it has to balance the negative impact from such tax, which impact creating the higher cost on that particular product, to compensate it to hopefully directly to that segment in other form that immediately replace the loss.
Very well noted, Pak Firman.
Okay, thank you. But I think I actually already discussed with the other speakers about this. But I just want to add that first, maybe what we need to do is like in the natural swap. So revenue swap will be very important to do this, because if we put it carbon tax in place on the policy implementations, we have to make sure that we also have to reduce the tax. It's also have been noticed by in the Nordic experience that we need to follow this step, which is we also can reduce by like income tax for the others, like for individuals, that we can just remove it, or we can reduce the rates for the compensation for put it in place the carbon tax, something like that. So I just want to add about the revenue neutrals. Thank you.
Okay.
That's all the comments.
Thank you. Dr. Paulberg, please.
Indonesia is one of the most suitable developing countries in the world for ensuring social protection after introduction of a carbon price. And this is thanks to all of the work by TNP Dorka, the National Team for Acceleration of Poverty Reduction over recent years. So a very simple way to do it would be collect some carbon price revenue and use a share of that revenue to increase the payments under the Social Protection Card, KPS, which is basically, it's a cash transfer program which goes to the lowest income households in Indonesia. Also, there are some other card programs like Smart Indonesia Card. So a very simple way to make sure that the benefits in terms of that revenue are shared with the most needy would be to increase the payments that are already going to those households under these cards. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jacqueline?
Thank you. I think I already talked about in my presentation these possibilities that Dr. Burke also touched on now. There are very good ways in Indonesia, I think, to protect the most vulnerable from the impact of price rises. And perhaps just to make clear once again, we know as well that the highest emitters and the ones who will pay the highest rates of this tax and the highest amounts of this tax will be people in higher income groups, because as the questioner said as well, people on low incomes tend to have a much lower carbon footprint. So if you think about ways of compensating those lower income groups, and you think about ways of providing substitutions, for example, for or free public transport tickets, or particular kinds of stoves that are low emissions, then I think you can address the problem very well while still implementing the polluter pays principle and ensuring that higher emitters are contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and paying for the pollution that they emit at the same time.
Thank you, Ibu Jacqueline. Now, Ibu Tara, would you like to add anything to the answers from the panelists?
Yes, just very briefly. I think it's really important to note that the impacts on the poor would be fairly short-lived. It wouldn't necessarily go on for the entire time the carbon tax is in place. What research has shown is that the poorest are mostly impacted by the inflationary impact of higher energy prices, and these tend to moderate after, in the short term, 2 to 5 years. So mechanisms, as other speakers have discussed, that can be in place in the short term, such as cash transfers and other assistance measures, don't need to be there forever. The positive impact of carbon taxation on productivity will start to take over after a couple of years. The stimulus effect of spending of carbon tax revenues will start to generate increased employment, increased productivity, and that boost to the economy will in itself start to assist the poor over time, at the same time as those inflationary impacts sort of scale down. So it's not something where we need to have some sort of permanent social payment to the poor the entire time the taxation is in place.
Thank you, Ibu Tara. So we do have 2 more questions, but before that, I would like to inform that I know it is very unfortunate that we only have a little bit more time to for Q&A in this webinar, and we have been receiving still until now very interesting questions, and we would like to apologize beforehand that we would not be able to answer all of the questions. And the committee also would like to remind all participants to fill in a form distributed to you. Those would be requesting for your contacts, I believe, so that you can receive the materials from the presenters. And we have the third question is from Julam Barraud from European Union. Interesting to know how Nordic taxonomy could be replicated in Indonesia, knowing that tax to GDP ratio in Sweden is 43%, in Norway 39%, and Indonesia 12%. And this is directed to, can the committee help me? Is this to all panelists or one?
To Paul and Tara, please. Thank you.
To Paul and Tara. Tara, if you will take the screen.
Sure. Look, it's a good question. I think we've kind of covered it in our presentations that you wouldn't necessarily go straight from 12% to 43% taxation, but the Nordic model does show a pathway where Indonesia could follow. Now, Indonesia does need to increase its GDP to tax ratio. It's very low, particularly post the pandemic. It's going to need extra revenues to pay down debt and for recovery. And fossil fuel taxation in particular has been demonstrated to be a particularly good way of raising revenues, much less impacts on productivity than increasing labour or business taxes. And it tends to also collect revenue from the informal sector, so sectors that are outside the normal taxation system. And so it's got a very broad base, which makes it a very effective tax, a very, very effective type of taxation. So while we don't necessarily, well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the Nordic model be implemented in its entirety in Indonesia immediately, I think the Nordic model does show a very viable pathway for Indonesia to increase its GDP to tax ratio.
Mr. Weston.
Yeah, I fully agree. And actually, it's sort of the opposite situation a little bit. Indonesia needs to increase its tax to GDP ratio, while Sweden actually had a more than a 50% to GDP tax ratio in the late 80s. And so we could actually benefit from lowering the tax to GDP ratio while green shifting the taxes. So it's a little bit the opposite situation, but I agree with Tara.
Okay, thank you.
Can
I believe there's
add some information
yes, of
on
course.
these questions.
This is Pak
thank
Firman,
you.
ya? Silakan, Pak.
Yes, this is Firman. Yes, I think one of the things that put it here that tax to GDP ratio is 43% in Sweden and also in Norway 39% and in Indonesia only 12%. Actually, it's not 12% now; it's 9.8%. But the difference is about the tax GDP ratio in Indonesia is not included social security contributions first. And then the second one, the models in the Indonesian tax to GDP ratio, we have different rates actually. If we just remove and also the sector that not heavily burdened, so it's like in plantations and agricultural sectors. So before we compare to like is Sweden 40% and Norway 39% and Indonesia only 12%, we have to also taking care of the other sectors in Indonesia that not heavily burdened. So I just want to add this information on these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Firman. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize. We're very sorry, but that's all the time that we have for our webinar. I know the questions keep coming in, but I believe the committees are taking well note of those questions. And I would like to remind you to fill in the form. Perhaps your questions are available, the answers are available in the presentation, in which you can receive by filling the form out. So that is the end of the second webinar of the IISD. It's already late according to agenda, so I am not going to provide you with a summary or a wrap up. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you also for the committee, for the participants, for speakers, of course, for everyone, for IISD and all institutions participating in this webinar. I'm Prita Suyudi signing off from this afternoon webinar. See you again. Good afternoon. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, everyone.
Tara, thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Pak Bagus, Pak Nur. Thank you, Dr. Berg. Thank you, Pak Firman.
Thank you, Bu Betty. Makasih.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Firman.
Terima kasih, Bapak Ibu.
Yeah.
Terima kasih, Bapak Ibu.
Pak Paul, maybe you can send my regard to Prof. Jotso, ya, from Nur.
Prof, which prof?
Prof. Jotso, Frank Jotso.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, of course. I will say hello to him for you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Great to see you, all of you. Thank you very much, Prita.
Thank you.
Stay healthy and safe, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Maaf ya, penutupannya ngebut.
It's okay. We were late already. Thank you, Pak Andi.
Izin pamit. Mari.
Terima kasih, Pak Andi.
Terima kasih.
Thank you very much for attending, all of the panelists. We really appreciate it from IISD.
Thank you, Tara.
And thank you, Ms. Pita. You did a wonderful job.
Oh, thank you, Tara. It's a pleasure.
Okay, it's late, so good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, Tara. Bye-bye.
Mbak Betty, aku live ya.
Yes. Mbak Prita, makasih ya.
Thank you. Okay.
Live ya.
Ya, Pak. Makasih, Pak Luki.